Hey, AP Comparative Politics folks, it's Miss Holloway, and I am going to be recording a lecture that I was going to give during the snow days, but now we're trying to make up some lost time. So hopefully this is going to be a helpful review for your exam next week. This is basically a review of the reading that you were required to do for your homework packet, plus some supplemental material I put together. So I hope that it helps you sort of put the pieces together of this unit, review some of the things we've covered in class, and teach you some of the things we didn't quite get to because of the snow days. So I'm going to post this to Schoology and to Remind, and if you have any questions, feel free to text me on Remind or email me. Otherwise, you can talk to me on Monday. So let's do it. So this is Intro to Comparative Politics. We're going to go over many of the terms in your packet, not all, but as many as I possibly can. So here we go. So again, the point of comparative politics is to compare. We're comparing countries from around the world, 6 countries, as you know, and there are different ways in which we compare them. Don't forget to talk about, in your homework packet, the way we analyze data and things like normative statements, empirical statements. Make sure you understand when we're making a statement that's fact-based versus opinion-based. So keep that in mind. But the bare bones basics that we're going to focus on today is what kinds of countries are we dealing with? How do they maintain sovereignty? What are their social, civil societies like? And what's sort of the outlook for today? With the countries that we have to compare, the 6 countries that we're focusing on, we have broken up into different kinds of countries. So political scientists use the term first world or advanced democracies to talk about countries that maintained a democratic system of government since World War II. So post-World War II, during the beginning of the Cold War, these typically are democratic countries that are allied with the US after World War II, Great Britain being one of the main first world countries. You could look at France and West Germany as other examples, but the one we're really going to focus on is Great Britain. That is an advanced democracy. It's also a liberal democracy, which we'll talk about a little later. We also have second world or communist, post-communist countries. Again, these terms come from the Cold War, so they're a bit outdated, which is why we use the terms advanced democracies or developing democracies typically today. But first, second, third world still is a commonly used metric to talk about these countries. When we're talking about second world countries, we're really talking about Russia and China. Russia being a post-communist country, China still being controlled by the Communist Party, so it is still a communist party, or communist country, excuse me. Then you have third world countries, which during the Cold War were typically unallied or unaligned with either the NATO countries or the Warsaw Pact countries. These were countries that were developing countries that typically were behind in industrial output than other first or second world countries, and we call them today developing democracies. This would be Nigeria, Mexico, and Iran. Now, there are many ways that these states maintain power. One of the biggest things that we're going to focus on this year in comparative politics is how do states, these countries, maintain their power? What are different ways that different government institutions maintain control over the people in their country? And there are different ways that states maintain power through legitimacy. Each state has to have some form of legitimacy. They have to have some kind of way to maintain their power or right to rule as determined by their citizens. So you can have charismatic legitimacy. This is often where you have a cult of personality. There's some leader that is incredibly charismatic. People are drawn to this person, and it's often a short-lived system because once that person dies or falls out of power, the charisma is gone, and therefore the people's allegiance to the government system is gone. So you have a great example of charismatic legitimacy in Iran with the Ayatollah Khomeini from the Iranian Revolution. Also Mao Zedong in China with the Communist Revolution, both very charismatic leaders that drew a bunch of support from the people, at least initially. The second kind of legitimacy, you could have rational legal legitimacy. This is typically the kind of legitimacy that we know in the United States. Essentially, these government systems have legitimacy because of a rule of law, not because of a persona or a charisma of a person, but because of a system of law that's established. Now, in governments around the world, there are different kinds of law systems that give a government legitimacy. One is common law. Now, common law is what we have in the United States, and Great Britain and Nigeria also run with the common law system. And this is really important in that it's based on tradition and legal precedents. So remember when we talked about with the Supreme Court of the United States, stare decisis, this idea that Supreme Court cases are often based on the decisions of Supreme Court decisions of the past or court decisions of the past. It's based on legal precedents and tradition. That is the system of common law, that you basically base your tradition of governance on what's been done in the past. That's common law. Code law is a little different. Code law is where you have a complex system of written laws and codes that typically determine how a country is run. And granted, all countries run with a system of laws and codes. We call them laws, obviously. But in a code law system, the primary basis of legitimacy for that government is not tradition or legal precedents, but rather codes that are passed by the current system of governance. Sharia law is the third that we're going to look at this year, and it's a bit different in that it is entirely derived from religious precepts, particularly the precepts of Islam. Iran, parts of northern Nigeria as well, which is historically controlled by a Muslim majority, run under Sharia law. Your legitimacy is based off of the Quran and the traditions of Islam. Now, third, which sort of ties in to Sharia law a bit, in that it's based on tradition, but it's separate, and that traditional legitimacy, a government gets its legitimacy not from law, not from a set of codes, not from charisma, but from tradition. Think about the British monarchy as a great example of traditional legitimacy. The British monarchy was able to maintain its power for so many hundreds of years because of traditional legitimacy. People just adhered to that system of government, adhered to that authority because that's the way it's always been done. And even though the British monarchy has fallen out of a lot of its power from hundreds of years ago, it still maintains its legitimacy because of traditional legitimacy. So here's a breakdown of the different kinds of laws that each of the country has. I think this is really important for you to know and something that you could use in your homework packet as well. So you have to know which the countries practice code law. China, Iran, and Russia, China, Mexico, and Russia, all operate under a system of code law, whereas Nigeria and Great Britain operate off of a common law system. Iran and parts of northern Nigeria also operate under a system of Sharia law. So make sure you understand the difference there. I think it's also important to recognize which countries have a system of judicial review, like in the United States. Don't forget about Marbury versus Madison. The idea that the justice system can review laws to determine if they're sound. We call them constitutional in the United States. Russia, Nigeria, and Mexico all have this system of judicial review, but China, Great Britain, and Iran traditionally do not. So there you go. So these countries all have legitimacy based on different models, but what affects legitimacy? What maybe would challenge or support a government's legitimacy, allowing them to stay in power or to fall out of power? There are many different elements. One of them is economic well-being. How is the country doing economically? If it's prosperous, typically there is no challenge to the authority or its legitimacy. But if it's crumbling economic system, typically you're going to have people challenging that legitimacy. Historic tradition, how long does legitimacy go back in time? What's the legacy like? The British monarchy is a great example. It has a long history of monarchy, and therefore it gives it strong legitimacy. People's satisfaction with the government's overall performance. Are they happy with how the government is treating them and how the government's protecting them? Nationalism and a shared political culture. Is there a sense of unity, commonality, nationalism that binds people together that would allow them to embrace the legitimacy of that government? Or is there a lot of disunity? Is there a lot of fragmentation and factionalism? that would challenge the legitimacy of the ruling party. One of the things that really affects legitimacy is obviously the people and the satisfaction of the people, and that really boils down to what we call political culture. What's the culture like in that country? What are the people's belief systems, and how does that impact the government itself? Political culture is defined as the collection of political values, beliefs, and institution the government is based on. And oftentimes, political culture is measured by something we call social capital. A great definition of this is factors of effectively functioning social groups that include such things as interpersonal relationships, a shared sense of identity, a shared understanding, shared norms, shared values, trust, cooperation, and reciprocity. We are going to talk about countries with high social capital and low social capital. A high social capital society is one that is effectively functioning socially. There are many social groups that exist that coexist peacefully. There's a common identity. There's a sense of um, protection of freedoms. There's a sense of ideas of norms and values that are protected, that the people have a certain level of autonomy. A country with low social capital, you're going to see a lot of infighting. You're going to see a lot of lack of respect, I guess, of the people, especially minority groups from the government, from the top down. And you're going to have a division and a lack of sense of identity or unity amongst the people. You see this a lot in illiberal democracies. Now, a successful democracy, is one that creates protections of civil liberties, allowing civil society to form, which creates higher social capital. So you got to keep in mind that when we're looking at some of the advanced democracies like Great Britain or the United States, for example, one of the things that makes those countries successful is that it protects civil liberties, that the people's right to freedom of speech, freedom of religion, for example, are protected and enforced. Places with low protection of civil liberties, and you could look at China, for example, democracy is not flourishing. It's suppressed. And so the protection of civil liberties goes hand in hand with democracy. It also allows civil society to form, which creates higher social capital, which we'll talk about in a second. So what are some of the challenges to governing and social capital? So if you're a government and you want to maintain peace within your country, there are many different factors to consider. One of those is what is going on in your society and divisions within your society. One of the major challenges to high social capital and a government itself is divisions, or what we call in AP comparative government, cleavages in society. So you have many different kinds of cleavages. There's national, ethnic. With national, you want to think about maybe there is a multinational state, so you have many different nations within the state. You can think of the former Soviet Union. You had various nations that were under the umbrella of the Soviet Union that simply did not coexist peacefully, and so it created divisions. Ethnic divisions, social cleavages is a huge problem in many of these countries that we're going to talk about. Linguistic cleavages is a big deal as well, that separate people. When you're looking at regional cleavages, you look at countries like Great Britain that have numerous regions within that nation that have different interests and different values, different shared identities, which can create division. And religious divisions, one of the great examples is when we look at Northern Ireland, there's a clear division between Protestants and Catholics, people that are loyal to Great Britain and people that support a separatist movement. We'll talk about that. You can also look at Nigeria as well, which has a stark contrast between the Christian population and the Muslim population that creates social cleavages that can be difficult for a government to reconcile. Now, there are two different kinds of cleavages: cross-cutting cleavages, which are divisions where citizens share some elements in common. So when you're looking at the Republic of Ireland or even Northern Ireland, for example, you might see divisions among class. But there's shared commonality in that Protestants may have both working class and middle class citizens. So Protestants share that core religious value in common, but there may be differences among them in class. Same with Catholics. So that's what we call a cross-cutting cleavage, and these tend to be pretty peacefully coexisting. There are elements where people join together and have commonality, and there's points of division. Now, a dangerous trend that tends to challenge governing is what we call a reinforcing cleavage or a coinciding cleavage. These are divisions that utterly separate citizens. For example, if you have one ethnic group in a country that comprises of the entire upper class or the entire middle class, and another entirely different ethnic group, and they're all the lower working class. So you pit one ethnic group against another, not only ethnically but socioeconomically. It creates huge and dangerous divisions amongst the people within that country. And so these reinforcing cleavages are very, very dangerous and something that we're going to look at as posing a serious threat to not only social capital but also governance. Another thing you want to look at when you're looking at the political culture, the people of a country, and how they operate, is are they consensual or conflictual? So that was part of your reading. A lot of this is part of your reading, but this I know is a big portion of it. You want to think about, like, are people coming together over most things? Is this their general unity, even though there might be division over certain issues? The United States, I know it may seem like we have a conflictual political culture, but we really have a consensual political culture. We, for the most part, all value morals and values like freedom and democracy and protecting people's freedom of religion, even though there might be clear social divisions. Conflictual political culture is a much more serious divide where you're pitting people against people, ethnic group against ethnic group, where there are serious divisions that cannot be reconciled. And you want to think about this idea of political efficacy. You know, how much do individuals think that they have a say in their government? How much do they have, do they believe that they have a voice or a role in creating change in their government? This is a chart that I'd like you to spend a little more time on in your spare time, so you may want to pause the video at this point. But I think it's incredibly important as we go through each of these countries to understand some of the major ethnic and religious groups that exist within these countries that could cause social divisions or cleavages. So you want to look at these stark divisions, or not so stark divisions, depending on where you're looking, and see how that affects the governance of a country, the policies of a country, and the political capital or social capital of that country. You want to particularly look at some of the really important distinctions between these countries. In some countries, you have stark religious differences. For example, in Nigeria, the difference between the Muslim and Christian populations, it's 50-40. That's going to cause considerable religious cleavages. But in Iran, you have an almost entirely Shia Muslim population. So you're going to have less religious divisions there, but divisions of a different kind in Iran. So it's important to look at sort of what causes these cleavages in each country. Okay, so ways that society interacts with governing. Another important thing to look at with society is not just how it's divided, but how is society interacting with the government? In America, in the United States, we have a really profound understanding of the connection between the people and the government. We are based on this idea of popular sovereignty. Not all governments are that way. So you've got to ask yourself a lot of questions when you're looking at different countries, such as how are the social cleavages affecting the government? Are these divisions really affecting people in a profound way that's affecting their lives? For example, are some groups being advantaged or disadvantaged? Are some groups being entirely left out of governing? We're going to look at a lot of these different countries and historically how minority groups have been oppressed and kept out of the governing system. And it's happening in many countries around the world. China is a great example of how any opposition party to the Communist Party is not welcome into the governing circle. How are citizen voices heard? So you got to consider the level of civil society, meaning, are there institutions where people are allowed to share their beliefs and values with other people and then advocate for those beliefs and values? Remember, we talked about different linkage institutions, the media, political parties, interest groups particularly. Are interest groups are allowed to thrive and survive, or are they suppressed by the government? How much political participation is there from each individual citizen and from these interest groups? And most importantly, I think, is irrelevant to the countries that we're going to look at, are there competitive elections? Even though they say they're democratic, are their elections actually fair and competitive? You want to look at Russia as a classic example of that. This is an illiberal democracy because their elections traditionally, historically, have not been competitive. They've been sort of rigged in one direction. Nigeria is a really relevant example. They had to push back their recent election, which was supposed to be for February 16th, now has been pushed to this Saturday because of this issue. Is it a competitive election? So it's a problem that has not gone away in democracies and still alive and well, and is something we need to watch carefully. How are citizens educated on their role in the government? Remember, we talked about in U.S. government how political parties play a huge role in educating the people about the issues that face the country and the government. How does that happen in other countries? How are citizens educated on their role specifically in the government, how to vote? What is their responsibility as a citizen? How much political socialization do they have? Where are they getting their political values and beliefs from? What is their level of political efficacy? Do they believe that they have the ability to change anything in the government or to participate at all? Now, one interesting trend that we're seeing in comparative politics and in the world in general is this idea of the global civil society. We no longer belong to institutions that affect us just regionally or nationally. We all belong to an international society, international world, thanks to globalization. So there are trends towards becoming a more international civil society, which is interesting, where we're one of a global neighborhood, so to speak. So you have different organizations like NGOs, non-governmental organizations, such as Amnesty International. At the bottom right, you see a bunch of other examples of NGOs in the image there. Where it's people coming from around the world to solve a global problem, for example. That's an NGO. Cosmopolitanism is also a key trend that's happening that's bringing people away from nationalism and more a collective globalized identity. Cosmopolitanism is this idea that there's a shared identity, global identity, shared values and norms amongst all citizens of the world instead of just being split into regional or national norms, values, and identities. Okay, so this is really important to look at when we're looking at political participation by country. So how much do people in each of these countries have political participation? So we look at China, incredible restrictions on political participation. There's huge censorship across the board. If you try using the internet in China, it looks very differently than if you try using the internet in the States. There's very, very stark and serious crackdowns on protest movements. Just referencing Tank Man from a couple decades ago. That's something that you should remember from your world history class, hopefully. But China has very low political participation from its people and very low transparency. In contrast, Great Britain has extensive political participation from its people. There's a high value on civic participation, and civil liberties are generally protected there. Iran has a very restricted political participation culture. So both of these, China and Iran, tend to be more authoritarian. So you should see a trend here. In more democratic regimes, you have higher political participation. In more authoritarian regimes, you have less political participation from the people. So similar censorship and repressive protests is also a norm for Iran. Mexico, on the other hand, has extensive political participation. Generally competitive elections, people come out to vote, and protests, which are generally protected. Right to protest is generally protected. Nigeria, similar but different in that Nigeria is fraught with corruption from the government. And so even though you do have a certain level of political participation and autonomy from the people, nevertheless you do have a really messy situation in that Nigeria is fraught with corruption, which we'll talk about. And Russia is, again, a tricky example because even though they say they're democratic, they're in a liberal democracy. So there's serious restrictions on political participation, competitive elections, things like that. Okay, now I'm going to go through this really quickly since we've talked about these already, but I wanted to remind you that political culture in a country shapes what we call political ideology. So depending on the beliefs, values, and history of the people and the government in a particular nation, it will manifest itself in one of these different political ideologies. So you might have liberalism. Keep in mind, this is not the same if you're looking at liberals versus conservatives in the United States. It's a very, very different concept. So look at it in isolation in AP Comparative. It's different. Liberalism is the trend that emphasizes individual liberty and freedom. That's the bare bones definition that you need to know about liberalism. There's things that within liberalism that are all about protecting freedom of speech and freedom of religion. Your civil liberties are protected in this trend of liberalism. Keep in mind, it's basically prioritizing freedom over any other value. And the flip side, you have communism as a political ideology that some countries ascribe to. Communism values equality over freedom. The freedom of the individual is oppressed for the sake of promoting equality of all citizens. So to achieve that, the government takes away resources from the individuals, abolishes private property, and redistributes the resources. Individual rights are then taken away for the sake of the state, the needs of the state. Socialism is an interesting hybrid between liberalism and communism. It values both individual liberty and the government promotion of equality. So you have a lot of tension regarding, okay, well, how much liberty versus equality do you have here? How much government promotion of equality do you have versus individual liberty? That's why you have such a debate over this in the United States. This tends to be way more broadly embraced in the European Union states, so keep that in mind. And of course, fascism, stark contrast to all the others really, in that it devalues both individual liberty and equality for the sake of total control of the state. Okay, so keep in mind, countries in general have tended towards liberalization and with that what we call marketization. So one of the exciting things about learning comparative politics today is that we're seeing a trend in most countries, especially the developing world, towards liberalization, towards freedom, and away from movements like fascism, and even communism is becoming a thing of the past. Economic liberalization goes hand in hand with political ideology, or political liberalization rather. They go hand in hand. So with individual freedom, typically comes this value of marketization or economic liberalization, meaning that you have freedom to participate in the free market. Businesses are less controlled by the government. Market forces determine the success or the failure of individual businesses and economies in general. So this is taking place worldwide. It's even replacing what we call a command economy in China. And we can blame that on a couple factors. One is globalization. We live in a globalized society where the free market really governs most economies. And so China has historically had a very hard time participating in a free market economy when they've been a command economy for so long. Take the USSR during the 1980s, for example, with Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan's policies, as well as what was happening in the USSR under Gorbachev, really forced the Soviet Union to say, we can no longer afford to be in a command economy. We have to give it up for a more free market approach. So the command economy model is really going away. Communist countries, again, relied on what we call a command economy, where an economy is managed by a party-dominated state. There's very little economic freedom. Private property is abolished for the most part. There's high control of businesses and the economy in general from the state. Now, countries are transitioning to what we call a mixed economy. Now, countries that are transitioning from more command economies have a decision to make. Do they adopt a mixed model or a market model? Market economies tending to be much more free and less government involvement, where mixed economies have much more privatization combined with government control. So the tension around the world is not, do we have a command economy, but more, to what extent do we have government control within a mixed economy model? So here's a breakdown of the different countries, who has what. So China has traditionally had a command economy. So did Russia. That makes sense. They're one is a former communist state, one is a current communist state. Now they're both mixed economies, along with all of the other countries we have. No country is a true free market um, economy. It just isn't realistic. Okay. Again, I'd recommend you pause at some of those charts, you guys, so that you can maybe take down those notes in that last column of your vocab charts for your homework. I think that would be a really good connection to make, as you will have to know these differences. Okay, so moving away from the economy, we're going to now focus on how do governments actually govern? How do they do this system of governance? And we've talked about this, so this is going to be a review for the most part. But you need to understand that within a state, there are, of course, regimes, right? So a long-standing method of governance. And within those regimes, there are institutions and systems that allow a government to function. So these are the systems that allow a government to actually do the job of governing. So what do those look like? A state at a broad level might be unitary or federal. Okay, so federal is one that you should be very familiar with because this is what we have in the United States. Remember, we talked about layer cake federalism versus marble cake federalism. Federalism meaning that you have various layers of governance. You have a federal government that controls the entire nation, and then you have state and local governments. So governance is split between different layers of government. Now, a unitary government, is very different. Governing happens in one central geographic place. You don't have all of these separate regional governments that interact with the national government quite like you have in the United States. And we'll take a look at examples in just a second. One of the things that states are having to grapple with today in the 21st century, and really back to the 20th century post World War I and World War II, Cold War era, is the idea of a global government or supranational organization. We have many of these around the world, and it's the idea of an organization that is composed of member states that have agreed to cede or to give up some sovereignty to the organization. So you have, for example, the United Nations, the European Union, NAFTA, NATO, OPEC. Okay, so if you don't know what any of those are, make sure that you pause and figure it out now, because those are very important to know. So the question becomes, how much power, how much sovereignty do individual nations give up? And how does that affect each country individually? Now, you have a great example in the Brexit situation with the UK right now. They are grappling with this question of, are we willing to give up so much sovereignty to an international organization that's maybe not having our best interest at heart? And so that's what's happening with the EU right now. Now, the interesting thing is that these supranational organizations are leading to two sort of opposing trends, which I find really interesting. One is that it leads to further globalization or interconnectivity of all the countries, that we're getting less and less into these separate kingdoms where we're operating autonomously or independently from other countries, and more we're interconnected. It's difficult to separate. This makes war a lot more complicated because you are much more tied, your destinies are much more tied together as nations and states. However, you're also seeing an opposite trend in reaction to all of this globalization and national organizations. That's called fragmentation, or the idea of ethnic and national identities coming back to the forefront, becoming more important than a global identity. People are retreating into their nations or their ethnic divisions, or even religious divisions for that matter, when we're looking at fundamentalism and saying that, no, this is the right way, this is my identity, I don't want to be associated with people that are the other, whoever the other might be. So you're seeing two competing forces there. Now, keep in mind, these countries deal with many issues when we're dealing with national organizations and forces of change around the world. There's two major forces that could happen within a country: centripetal and centrifugal. Centripetal forces keep countries united. Nationalism, even though it's been kind of used as a bad word in recent years, nationalism in some ways can be very positive in that it brings people together, unites a nation. Centrifugal forces, I hope I'm saying that right, physics people. Centrifugal forces are forces that divide countries, and you're seeing this in a huge way around the world today. Countries are divided by a lot of different factors. Look at those political and social cleavages we looked at earlier. Those play a role. One of the big things are what we call separatist movements. Separatist movements are movements of people, sometimes entire nations within a state, that say, you know what, we want our independence away from you. We think we deserve a nation of our own. We're going to try to separate from you. You can look at all the Soviet satellite blocks from the USSR that had nationalism movements. That's a great example of separatist movements. The Scottish independence referendum a couple years ago, where Scotland had a referendum to try to break away from the rest of the UK, which is really interesting. So that's becoming a force of division within some of these countries. Now, states deal with these dividing forces, these centrifugal forces, in a lot of different ways, but the main way that we're going to look at in AP Comparative is something called devolution. Devolution is the process of transferring power from a central power authority to more regional governments. And you're seeing this particularly in Great Britain, where in response to things like the Scottish independence movement, Great Britain, instead of honoring the separatist movement, says, okay, listen, we are going to take some of our power and distribute it to some of the smaller regional governing authorities. And so thereby empowering the people of Scotland with more regional and local control over what affects their region. Okay, so this chart is going to give you an idea of what kind of system each of these countries have, and also the supranational organization membership that they might be a part of, which is really interesting. And we're only looking at a few memberships here. There are others that aren't represented here, obviously, but these, especially the European Union and the World Trade Organization, are going to be pretty important to know. So I'll give you a second to pause the video to take a look at some of those different systems, and then we'll move on to the next slide. Okay, so now that we've talked about all of these different elements of governance, how governments maintain their legitimacy, and then some of the major broad ways the government is broken up into unitary or federal systems, and how they maintain control over different forces within their country for division. Now let's look at specific kinds of government institutions. Okay, so you have, as we've talked about in class, you have two different kinds of heads of state or head of government. So you could have a head of state, which is a ceremonial title, just like, for example, the Queen of England is a head of state, versus the head of government, who is the chief legislator. You might have both in a country, you might have just one, but the UK is a great example. You have the Queen as the head of state, and the head of government is the Prime Minister, who is the actual legislator, who is getting stuff done with the legislature itself. You might have a president, a prime minister, or both, depending on if you're in a semi-presidential system or not. A president, the key difference here, is elected independently from the legislature. So like in the United States, the people and the Electoral College elect the president, not the House of Representatives or the Senate. In contrast, a prime minister is elected by the majority party in parliament. It's separate from the people, and so that's the key difference there. Now, both a president and a prime minister might have a cabinet. They all do have a cabinet, but how they're selected and what they look like looks differently depending on if you are in a presidential or a parliamentary system. Typically, a cabinet represents a group of ministers appointed by a president. So in a presidential system, they're appointed by the president and then approved typically by the legislature. Or if you're in a parliamentary system, the majority parties within the ruling party select those cabinet members, which is interesting. So they typically represent the majority party leaders. They represent people that are higher up in the party system themselves, and then they serve under the prime minister. Now, one of your key vocab words is a cabinet coalition. This is kind of an interesting term in that if you take Great Britain, for example, if there is no majority party, there's no party that has a majority number of votes within the parliament, you have to have a cabinet coalition, meaning that you have members from many different parties working within the cabinet itself, because you might have a coalition government in which multiple parties are ruling at the same time, not just, for example, the Labour Party or the Conservative Party. Let's talk about how a legislature is broken up. Just like the United States, legislatures can be bicameral or comprised of two houses, typically an upper and a lower house, where you have the lower house more closely connected with the people themselves. Or it can be unicameral. So think about the root words there. Unicameral meaning one house. So there's only one house within that legislature. Now, this is important to take a look at. If they are what we call symmetrical, they rely on each other to pass legislation, just like the US, right? Like a bill has to pass the House of Representatives and the Senate in order to be sent up to the president himself. But in some countries, like Great Britain, it's asymmetrical. One house can only slow down the progress of the other. They can't totally block the legislation from the other house. So keep that in mind. Some countries, the houses have to work together to pass legislation. Others, it's not necessarily the case. One house could on its own pass legislation if it wanted to. Okay, so here's a chart that'll break down the examples. Okay, so let's look at the head of state to start. You've got the president as the head of state in all of these different systems except for Great Britain. And the head of government's a little different. If you look at Nigeria, Iran, and Mexico, the head of state is the same as the head of government. That happens a lot. Same with the United States. In Russia, though, the head of state is the president, the head of government is the prime minister. In Great Britain, the prime minister is the head of government. And then in China, what we call the premier is the head of government, and the head of state is separate. Okay, so elections around the world. How do they work? There are many different ways an election could work, and we're talking not just presidential, but also legislative elections, regional elections, etc. So you might have a primary election where political parties allow voters to select the party's candidate for the general election. We talked about open and closed primaries in our last unit of U.S. government. Excuse me. So hopefully you remember that a little bit. General elections. This is where voters select office holders. Simply put, they get one vote that goes towards an office holder. That's a general election. Now, a two-ballot election is interesting. If no candidate receives more than 50% of the popular vote, a runoff is scheduled between the top two vote getters. That happens in some states for governor in the United States, but this happens in some countries around the world wherein if no candidate receives more than 50% of the popular vote, they have to have a runoff, a separate election between the two. Referendums. Referendums are where an election occurs where the government allows the public to vote directly on a policy issue, basically going around or circumventing the legislature. So the Brexit referendum is a great example where they asked the people of Great Britain what the legislature should do. They had a referendum on Brexit, and the people spoke and said they wanted to get out of the EU. That's a referendum. Now in the British Parliament, referendums work a little differently in that the legislature doesn't always have to follow the requests of the people, but the referendum is how the people speak to the legislature, essentially. And an initiative is a different way that elections can work. An initiative is where the people themselves can propose a policy or law and put that on the ballot, given certain requirements. Like in the state of Washington, you have to have a certain number of signatures on a petition, and voters can then place issues on the ballot. That's an initiative. Okay, so I am not going to go through this chart since it's pretty extensive, but I am going to have you take a look at a couple different sections here, particularly like how is each president or prime minister selected in each of these countries, and do they allow referendums? Referendums say a lot about whether the voice of the people is heard or not in a lot of ways. So keep that in mind, pause the video, and take some time to look at this chart. Okay, within any country, you are going to have obviously governments working differently societies that look very differently, have different cleavages and divisions, but all of them have linkage institutions that link the people to the government. Remember, we talked about political parties as a linkage institution. It's very important. And there's different party systems in different countries around the world. You might have a one-party system where only one party is allowed to exist. You might have a similar system in where it's a dominant party system, where officially smaller parties can exist. However, the dominant party, through a series of rules, regulations, laws that are passed, and possibly corruption, the dominant party is almost always assured a large victory and control of the government, regardless of how the smaller parties do. You might have a two-party system like in the United States, where smaller parties exist and they compete, but are generally unable to win the electoral majority simply by virtue of how the two parties control houses of Congress or how the electoral system works. In a two-party system, it's very difficult for smaller parties to compete. And in a true multi-party system, you have numerous parties competing fairly equally, and sometimes no party can win a majority, and so a coalition government is necessary. Now remember, another linkage institution are interest groups. In authoritarian societies like China, no interest groups can exist without the say-so or permission of the state. So in China, you have only what are called transmission belt interest groups that only churn out like a factory the interests and the mantras of the party, the Communist Party. No other interest groups are allowed to exist that conflict with that ideology. Now, it's very different in the United States and in other liberal democracies like Great Britain. There is interest group pluralism. It allows for a high level of social capital where many interest groups exist and compete within the country and influence public policy. So here you have the breakdown of what different kinds of party systems each country has. China has a one-party system, obviously the Communist Party. You have a two-party system in Great Britain, plus regional parties. They tend to be much more able to have representation from third parties in the United States, and we'll talk about why when we get to the Great Britain unit. Iran has no official party system, which I find really interesting. Mexico and Nigeria both multi-party systems, and then Russia has what we call a dominant party system. So even though these countries are vastly different, all of them deal with similar kinds of issues. We're going to look at how these countries deal with economic stability, social welfare, civil rights and liberties, among other issues. Remember, economic stability is measured by different kinds of measuring devices: gross domestic product, gross national product, purchasing power parity. Please know the differences between those three, or four rather, they're in your reading. One of your key vocab words is what we call austerity. Austerity can be tricky when you look it up on Google, but austerity basically means that they're measures that are taken by a government in which to cut budget deficits, to deal with budget problems by cutting spending. So you see austerity measures in the history of Great Britain a lot, and we'll talk about that when we get to that unit, but that's what austerity means. Many countries deal with how to maintain the welfare of their people, social welfare. And to measure that, political historians, political scientists look at what we call the Human Development Index, which looks at things like life expectancy, literacy rates, stuff that you can find on Gapminder, which is really interesting. So if you want to look at your particular assigned country to see what the Human Development Index is, look at some of those factors like literacy, like access to health care, like life expectancy, and that'll give you a good idea of their social welfare. Also, the Democracy Index put out by The Economist is really important in providing some insight into this. The higher the higher up a country rather is on the Democracy Index, the better social welfare typically the people are going to enjoy. Okay, and this will give you an idea of what I really wanted you to look at is the GDP and the Human Development Index of each country. So you'll see that, for example, Great Britain has the highest GDP of all the countries, whereas Nigeria has the lowest. You want to look at also Human Development Index. In Russia and Great Britain, it's considered very high, whereas Nigeria is considered relatively low. So take some time to look at those different countries, to look at this chart, to look at GDP, to look at HDI, and really get a sense of where these countries are in those metrics. So in closing, you guys, and thank you for being so patient. If you've watched this far, I'm very impressed with you. Way to go. I know it's so not as exciting as when we're actually in class interacting with questions and stuff like that. But I hope this helps you a little bit as you prepare for the test. That's really my hope, is to give you a little extra boost as you study. But this is it. This is the home stretch here. So what's the outlook for countries today? Countries continue to demand change through various types of change, ways to achieve change, rather. Reform, revolution, and coup d'etats, or coups, as we're going to look at in the reading. So when we're looking at reform, reform means that a country wants to change things within the existing regime or the existing institutions. They don't want a massive overhaul of the system, but trying to reform the system to be better for the country itself. So you want to look at, for example, Great Britain moving towards a national healthcare system. That's a way they reformed their healthcare system. That wasn't a revolution, it wasn't a coup, but it was within the existing government. They reformed the way they did healthcare. Revolution is entirely different. Revolutions tend to be violent. They tend to be an overhaul of the current system to put in a new regime or at least a new leader over the governing institutions. And a coup d'etat is typically military controlled, where you have a military-backed leader in which the military takes control and then and is dominant over the country for a time. And typically it's difficult for that country to leave military control behind and become a more stable, peaceful institution. We'll talk about that when we get to Nigeria, for example. So different attitudes to change dictate how citizens react to the change. You might have radicals who look at change and want to embrace it radically, maybe with violence. They see radicalism as the only way to achieve change within their government. Look at the USSR, for example, in the Russian Revolution in the 1910s. That's where we had radicals overthrowing the Tsarist government and instituting communism. You might have reactionaries as well, who are looking at the current system of government and reacting to their policies and wanting to go back to a different time. And often that can be associated with violence as well. Liberalism is associated with a more reform-based look at change. They want to change things from within peacefully and over time. Conservatism values the same type of reform as a form of change, but much more slowly, and they're much more hesitant to embrace change than the liberals would be. Now, overall in the world, we're seeing a lot of trends. Today, you see overall trends towards democratization. More and more countries are embracing the values and the institutions of democracy, leaving behind authoritarian regimes. More and more you see more liberal democracies popping up and competitive elections taking place. Although this tends to be very, very difficult and arduous in developing countries where you see a slow transition from corruption and illiberal democracies. Take Nigeria and Mexico for examples there. Now, the key to instituting successful democracies is multifold, but it's important when you're looking at a democracy, to make it a true liberal democracy, you have to improve civil society. It increases political participation. When you have a plurality of linkage institutions and interest groups, you are then able to have a truly functioning civil society. Transparency. People need to know what's going on in their government. There needs to be free media that is free to operate without the corruption of the government. And checks on the tyranny of the majority. One dominant group should not be allowed to dominate not only society, but the governance as well, or the government as well. Privatization of free market economies is becoming a trend, moving away from command economies. Cosmopolitanism, people are generally seeing themselves as global citizens, less so than national citizens, citizens of a particular nation or state. But at the same time, you also have this trend of fragmentation, which is going away from cosmopolitanism, where divisions are arising out of ethnic and religious differences. People are really clinging to their tribes and seeing their ethnicity or their religion as better than others and using that as their rallying cry for either government or revolution or any other radical approaches to change. So we could look at this chart to take a look at different types of change that have happened to each of these countries. I do want you to become familiar with this, you guys. We will be going over the history of these individual countries later, but this is very important for you to recognize which countries have experienced revolution, which ones have experienced coups d'etats, which ones have experienced periods of reform, and when did those take place. So please keep in mind, like, you must know about the Communist Revolution by Mao Zedong in China. You have to know about the Iranian Revolution in 1979. You have to know about the Communist Revolution in Russia in 1917. So these are things that you are going to have to know for sure. So take time to pause the video and look over this chart and begin to maybe even make yourself a timeline. That might be helpful. Okay, so guys, that's it. I hope this was helpful. If you have questions, please send me a text and a remind. That's probably more immediate than me checking my email. And have a wonderful weekend. I'm excited to see you all, and I hope you had a really restful couple of weeks, and I'll see you real soon.